At 11:17 a.m. on August 9, 1944, First Lieutenant Thomas Kowalski sat in the left seat of a B-17G Flying Fortress, nicknamed Liberty's Last, watching the oil refineries of Ploiești, Romania, disappear beneath a curtain of smoke and flame. 25 years old, 19 combat missions, zero room for mistakes. The 449th Bombardment Group had just completed their bombing run over one of the most heavily defended targets in Europe. Ploiești supplied 30% of Germany's fuel. The Luftwaffe and Romanian air defense forces protected it with everything they had. 412 anti-aircraft guns ringed the refineries. German Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Romanian IAR-80 fighters prowled the sky in packs of 6 or 8 aircraft. Every mission to Ploiești was a calculated risk. Every crew knew the numbers. In the summer of 1944, 1 out of every 4 bombers sent to Ploiești did not return. Kowalski's B-17 was part of a 48 aircraft formation from the 449th, flying out of Grottaglie Army Airfield in southern Italy. The mission briefing had been straightforward. Strike the Astra Romana refinery complex in the heart of Ploiești. Destroy the cracking towers and storage tanks. Cripple Germany's fuel production. Return to base. The formation had penetrated Romanian airspace at dawn, climbing to 23,000 feet to stay above most of the flak. The approach had been clean. No early fighter contact. No mechanical problems. Liberty's Last held position in the middle of the formation, surrounded by other B-17s whose propellers churned the thin air into invisible turbulence. Then they reached the initial point. The IP was the last navigation checkpoint before the bomb run. From the IP to the target, bombers flew straight and level. No evasive maneuvers. No variations in course. The Norden bomb site required stability to calculate the proper release point. For 3.5 minutes, the formation was completely predictable. For 3.5 minutes, every anti-aircraft gun crew on the ground knew exactly where the bombers would be. The flak started immediately. Black puffs of 80 meters explosions appeared at altitude, forming a cloud of shrapnel that the formation had to fly through. Kowalski felt the concussions. Each burst sent shock waves through the airframe. Metal fragments punched holes through aluminum skin. Liberty's Last shuddered as shrapnel tore through the wings and fuselage. Second Lieutenant Anthony Marino sat in the co-pilot seat, monitoring engine instruments. Second Lieutenant David Pemberton occupied the bombardier station in the nose, eye pressed to the Norden site. Second Lieutenant James Keller navigated from the compartment beside Pemberton. 8 more men were stationed throughout the aircraft. Staff Sergeant Raymond O'Brien manned the top turret behind the flight deck. Staff Sergeant Walter Czarnecki operated the ball turret beneath the fuselage. Staff Sergeant Eugene Petrov handled the radio. Staff Sergeant Harold Levine and Staff Sergeant Vincent D'Angelo covered the waist, gun positions. Staff Sergeant Michael Sullivan operated the tail gun. Technical Sergeant Arthur Bennett served as flight engineer. Pemberton released the bomb load at 11:16 a.m. 8 500-pound general-purpose bombs dropped toward the refinery, 23,000 feet below. The B-17 lurched upward as 4 tons of high explosive fell away. Kowalski banked left, following the formation toward the rally point. The bombers would regroup, form up, and head southwest toward the Adriatic. Once over water, they would be relatively safe. Fighter cover from the 332nd Fighter Group would meet them over the coast. The mission would be complete. But at 11:17 a.m., exactly 60 seconds after bombs away, engine number 3 caught fire. The Wright R-1820 Cyclone engine on the inboard right position erupted in flames. One moment it was running normally, producing 200 horsepower at 2,500 RPM. The next moment, orange fire was streaming back along the cowling. Marino saw it first. The temperature gauge for number 3 engine spiked into the red zone. Oil pressure dropped to 0. The tachometer needle swung wildly. Marino's hand went to the fire warning panel. The light for engine 3 was blazing red. He turned to Kowalski and pointed at the right wing. Kowalski looked out his side window and saw flames. The fire was not small. It was not a minor engine malfunction that could be managed with throttle adjustments and careful monitoring. The entire engine nacelle was burning. Flames extended 4 feet behind the cowling, fed by aviation fuel and hydraulic fluid. The aluminum skin on the inboard section of the right wing was beginning to blister from the heat. Standard procedure was clear. Engine fire in flight required immediate action. First, pull the mixture control to idle cutoff, starving the engine of fuel. Second, activate the built-in fire suppression system. Each engine had a CO2 bottle that could flood the nacelle with carbon dioxide, smothering the flames. Third, feather the propeller. Feathering meant rotating the propeller blades to align with the airflow, minimizing drag. A windmilling propeller on a dead engine created massive resistance. A feathered propeller allowed the aircraft to maintain speed and altitude on the remaining engines. The entire emergency procedure took approximately 90 seconds when everything worked correctly. Kowalski reached for the mixture control for engine 3. He pulled it back to idle cutoff. The fuel flow stopped. The engine should have begun to die. But the fire continued. Fuel was leaking from somewhere in the system. A ruptured line, a damaged fitting. Something was feeding the flames. Marino hit the fire suppression button. They heard the CO2 bottle discharge. A white mist appeared briefly around the engine nacelle as carbon dioxide vented into the cowling. The fire diminished for 3 seconds. Then it roared back, bigger than before. The CO2 had been insufficient. The fire was burning too hot, consuming fuel faster than the suppression system could smother it. Kowalski's hand went to the feathering button for engine 3. The feathering mechanism was electrical. A motor rotated the propeller hub, changing the blade angle from fine pitch to feather position. The blades would turn edge-on to the wind. The propeller would stop windmilling. Drag would be minimized. But when Kowalski pressed the feathering button, nothing happened. The propeller continued spinning. The blades remained at fine pitch. The feathering motor had failed. Either the electrical system was damaged or the motor itself was destroyed. The exact cause did not matter. The result was the same. Engine 3 was on fire, and the propeller was creating so much drag that Liberty's Last was falling behind the formation. If you want to see how Kowalski's crew feathered that propeller by hand in 4 minutes while flames consumed the engine, hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Kowalski. The B-17 was designed to fly on 3 engines. Boeing engineers had built redundancy into every system. Losing one engine was survivable, but only if that engine was feathered. A windmilling propeller on a dead engine created approximately 200 pounds of drag. The 3 remaining engines had to overcome that drag, plus the normal aerodynamic resistance of the aircraft. At 23,000 feet, in thin air where engines produced less power, this was barely possible, and that was assuming the aircraft was not on fire. Liberty's Last began losing airspeed. The formation was maintaining 180 miles per hour. Kowalski's bomber was at 175, then 170. The gap was opening. Other B-17s were pulling ahead. The left wing position, the aircraft directly ahead. One by one, they moved away from Liberty's last. In bomber formations, staying together meant survival. Concentrated defensive fire from multiple aircraft could drive off fighter attacks. Stragglers were picked off. A lone bomber was easy prey for German fighters that circled damaged aircraft like sharks. Marino was watching the fire. The flames had spread from the engine nacelle to the wing root. The wing itself was burning now. Aluminum skin was melting. Internal structure was being consumed. The fuel tanks were in the wings. If fire reached tank number 3, the wing would explode. Everyone aboard would die instantly. There would be no time to bail out, no chance of survival. The fuel tank was approximately 8 feet forward of the burning engine. The fire was spreading at roughly 6 inches per minute. Simple mathematics. 16 minutes until catastrophic structural failure. Technical Sergeant Arthur Bennett appeared in the cockpit. He had been monitoring the situation from the flight engineer's station behind the pilots. He could see the smoke pouring through gaps in the wing panels. He could smell burning metal and hydraulic fluid. He knew what needed to happen. The propeller had to be feathered manually. There was no other option. If the propeller continued windmilling, the bomber would fall too far behind the formation. German fighters would attack. The crew would have to bail out over Romania. Those who survived the parachute landing would be captured. But if the propeller could be feathered, if drag could be reduced, Liberty's last might make it back to the formation. They might make it to the Adriatic. They might make it home. The problem was access. The feathering mechanism was inside the propeller hub. On the ground, mechanics used specialized tools to manually rotate the blades. They worked from ladders and scaffolding. They had time and proper equipment. In flight, at 23,000 feet, with the aircraft traveling at 170 miles per hour, with engine number 3 on fire, none of that was available. The only way to reach the propeller hub was to climb out onto the wing, to crawl across aluminum skin while wind tore at clothing and equipment, to work next to an engine that was burning at temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, to somehow manipulate the feathering mechanism with bare hands while wearing heavy gloves and oxygen masks and flight suits designed for frigid high-altitude conditions. Bennett explained this to Kowalski in 5 short sentences. There was no debate. Kowalski looked at the altimeter. 23,000 feet. Temperature outside was minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Then he looked at the fire. Flames were now 6 feet long, streaming back from the engine cowling. He looked at the formation. Other bombers were half a mile ahead now. The decision was obvious. Bennett had to try. He had to climb out onto that wing. He had to feather the propeller manually, or everyone aboard was going to die. Bennett moved to the rear of the flight deck. Staff Sergeant Raymond O'Brien climbed down from the top turret position. He understood what Bennett was planning. He understood that one man could not do this alone. The wing was curved. The surface was slippery. Wind pressure at 170 miles per hour would peel a man off the metal skin and throw him into the slipstream. Bennett would need an anchor, someone to hold him, someone to keep him from being blown off the aircraft. O'Brien volunteered immediately. He was 24 years old. He weighed 180 pounds. He was strong enough to hold Bennett if Bennett could get a grip on something solid. They crawled through the bomb bay. The catwalk was narrow. Wind screamed through gaps where bomb bay doors had not sealed completely. They reached the waist gun position where Levine and D'Angelo were watching the fire through the starboard window. The flames were clearly visible from inside the fuselage. Smoke was pouring into the cabin through ventilation gaps. The crew was breathing through oxygen masks. Without oxygen at this altitude, they would pass out in 30 seconds. They would be dead in 2 minutes. Bennett opened the waist gun window on the right side. Immediately, wind exploded into the cabin. Papers, loose equipment, anything not secured was sucked towards the opening. The temperature dropped another 20 degrees. D'Angelo and Levine braced themselves against the fuselage wall. O'Brien grabbed a structural support beam with both hands. Bennett positioned himself at the window opening. He looked out at the wing. Engine 3 was 15 feet away. The nacelle was completely engulfed in flames. Heat radiated from the burning metal. Even from this distance, Bennett could feel it on his face. The wing's surface was aluminum alloy, painted olive drab on top, gray underneath. Between the fuselage and Engine 3, the distance was approximately 20 feet. Bennett would have to crawl across that 20 feet while holding on to what? The wing surface was smooth. There were no handholds, no rails, no safety equipment. The only features were access panels, rivet lines, and the slight curve of the airfoil shape. Bennett would have to press himself flat against the metal and inch forward using friction alone. He climbed out. His boots found purchase on the wing root. His gloved hands spread wide against the cold metal. Wind hit him like a physical force. 170 miles per hour of air pressure trying to peel him off the wing. He pressed his body down flat. His flight suit flattened against his chest and legs. Breathing became difficult. The oxygen mask was being pressed against his face by wind force. He began crawling forward, 6 inches, 1 foot, 2 feet. O'Brien was leaning out the waist gun window, holding Bennett's left ankle. The grip was tenuous. If Bennett slipped, if his hands lost purchase, O'Brien would not be able to hold him. The wind would rip Bennett off the wing and into the sky. He would tumble through space for 23,000 feet. His parachute might not deploy. Even if it did, he would land in Romania, capture or death. Those were the only outcomes. Bennett reached the engine nacelle. The heat was overwhelming. Flames were 3 feet from his position. The metal skin on the wing was hot enough to burn through his gloves. He could feel blisters forming on his palms. The pain was immediate and severe. He gritted his teeth and kept moving. The propeller hub was directly in front of him now. The hub was a cylindrical housing approximately 18 inches in diameter. Inside the housing was the feathering mechanism, a series of gears, push rods, and actuators that controlled blade angle. Normally, the electric motor rotated these components. With the motor dead, someone had to rotate them by hand. The problem was, the propeller was still spinning. The blades were rotating at approximately 800 RPM. Not as fast as normal operating speed, but fast enough to be lethal. Each blade was 9 feet long and weighed 40 pounds. If a blade struck Bennett, it would kill him instantly. He had to time his movements. Wait for a blade to pass, reach into the hub, manipulate the mechanism, pull his hand back before the next blade came around. The timing window was a fraction of a second, and he had to do this while lying flat on a wing in 170 miles per hour wind, next to an engine that was on fire. Inside the cockpit, Kowalski was fighting to keep the aircraft level. The asymmetric thrust from the dead engine was creating a constant yaw to the right. He was using left rudder to compensate. His left leg was fully extended, pushing the rudder pedal as hard as he could. Marino had his hands on the control yoke, helping to hold the wings level. The bomber wanted to roll right. The burning engine was creating drag on that side. The aircraft was trying to enter a spiral. If Kowalski and Marino lost control for even a few seconds, Liberty's last would roll inverted. Everyone aboard would die. Bennett studied the propeller hub. He could see the access panel, a metal cover held in place by 8 screws. The screws required a screwdriver. Bennett had brought a screwdriver from the tool kit. He pulled it from his belt. His hands were shaking. The cold, the fear, the pain from the burns on his palms. He positioned the screwdriver against the first screw head. The propeller blade whistled past 6 inches from his face. Wind from the passing blade buffeted his helmet. He began turning the screw. It was frozen in place. Months of vibration and temperature cycling had locked the threads. He applied more pressure. The screwdriver slipped. The blade came around again. Bennett ducked. The blade missed him by 4 inches. At 11:21 a.m., 4 minutes after the fire started, Liberty's last was at 22,500 feet. The aircraft had lost 500 feet of altitude. Airspeed was down to 165 miles per hour. The formation was now a full mile ahead. Kowalski could barely see the other bombers. They were dark specks against the sky. German fighters would spot Liberty's last soon. A lone bomber, separated from the formation, on fire. Easy target. The kill would be simple. One pass with 20 mm cannons. The B-17 would disintegrate. Bennett got the first screw loose, then the second. His fingers were numb. The cold was penetrating his gloves. He could not feel the screwdriver handle anymore. He was working by muscle memory. 3rd screw, 4th screw. The propeller kept spinning. Each blade passage was a reminder that one mistake would be fatal. 5th screw, 6th. His right hand was bleeding. A blister had burst. Blood was mixing with hydraulic fluid on the wing surface. 7th screw. The access panel was almost free. 8th screw. Done. He removed the access panel. The feathering mechanism was visible inside the hub. A series of metal push rods connected to a central actuator. The push rods controlled the blade angle. Bennett had to rotate the actuator 90 degrees. That would move the push rods. The push rods would change the blade angle. The blades would feather. But the actuator was designed to be rotated by an electric motor, producing 50 foot-pounds of torque. Bennett's hands, weakened by cold and burns, would have to produce the same force. He gripped the actuator. It would not move. He pulled harder. Nothing. The mechanism was under load. The spinning propeller was creating centrifugal force on the blades. That force was resisting any change in blade angle. Bennett needed leverage. He positioned the screwdriver against the actuator. He used the screwdriver as a pry bar. He pushed. The actuator moved 1 degree, 2 degrees. His hands were screaming with pain. The burns were getting worse. The metal was too hot. He kept pushing. 5 degrees, 10 degrees. The propeller blade came around. Bennett ducked flat against the wing. The blade missed him by 2 inches. Inside the fuselage, O'Brien was still holding Bennett's ankle. His grip was weakening. He had been holding on for 3 minutes. His hands were cramping. Staff Sergeant Eugene Petrov had moved up from the radio compartment to help. He grabbed O'Brien around the waist. If Bennett slipped, Petrov and O'Brien would both pull. They would try to drag him back to the window. They might succeed. They might not. But they would try. Bennett pushed the actuator another 10 degrees. 20 degrees total. The blades were beginning to change angle. He could see the pitch shifting slightly. The propeller was still spinning, but slower now. 700 RPM. The change in blade angle was creating more drag on the rotation. The propeller was fighting itself. Bennett pushed harder. 30 degrees, 40 degrees. His vision was starting to blur. Hypoxia. His oxygen mask had been partially dislodged by the wind. He was not getting enough oxygen. At 22,000 feet, the air contained less than half the oxygen available at sea level. Without supplemental oxygen, he would pass out. He adjusted the mask with one hand, held the screwdriver with the other, pushed. 50 degrees. The fire was spreading. Flames had reached the wing root. The fuel tank was 6 feet away now. 5 feet. The aluminum skin was glowing red. Internal structure was visible through holes burned in the outer panels. The fuel tank was a rubberized bladder surrounded by aluminum ribs and stringers. If flames penetrated the tank, 400 gallons of 100-octane aviation gasoline would ignite. The explosion would blow the entire wing off the aircraft. Liberty's last would cartwheel through the sky. No one would survive. Bennett pushed the actuator to 60 degrees, 70 degrees. The propeller was slowing, 500 RPM. The blades were approaching feather position, almost there. 80 degrees. His hands slipped. The screwdriver fell from his grip. It tumbled off the wing and disappeared into the slipstream. Bennett grabbed the actuator with both hands. No leverage now, just brute strength. He pulled. 85 degrees. His muscles were failing. He could not feel his fingers anymore. The burns, the cold, the lack of oxygen. His body was shutting down. 90 degrees. The propeller blades snapped into feather position. The rotation stopped. The blades were aligned with the airflow. Edge on to the wind. Drag dropped immediately. Liberty's last surged forward. Kowalski felt it instantly. The rudder pressure decreased. The aircraft stopped trying to yaw right. Airspeed began increasing. 165 miles per hour. 170. 175. The bomber was accelerating. The formation was still ahead, but the gap was not widening anymore. Liberty's last was holding its own. Bennett collapsed against the wing. He had done it. 4 minutes. 4 minutes of crawling across a wing at 22,000 feet. 4 minutes next to an engine burning at 2,500 degrees. 4 minutes of manipulating a mechanism designed for electric motors using only his hands and a screwdriver. 4 minutes. That saved 10 lives. O'Brien and Petrov began pulling. They dragged Bennett back toward the waist gun window. His body slid across the wing's surface. His burned hands left bloody streaks on the aluminum. They pulled him through the window opening. He fell onto the cabin floor. D'Angelo and Levine grabbed him. They laid him flat. His hands were destroyed. Third-degree burns covered both palms. The skin was charred black in places. Blisters covered his fingers. Blood seeped through the damaged tissue. Petrov opened the first aid kit. He had morphine syrettes. He injected 2 into Bennett's thigh. The pain began to fade. Bennett's breathing slowed. His eyes closed. He was going into shock. Petrov wrapped the burned hands in gauze. He elevated Bennett's feet. He covered him with spare flight suits to maintain body temperature. There was nothing else he could do. Bennett needed a hospital. He needed surgery. He needed skin grafts and antibiotics and months of recovery. But for now, he was alive. In the cockpit, Kowalski was climbing. With the propeller feathered, drag had decreased by 70%. The 3 remaining engines were producing enough thrust to regain altitude. Liberty's last climbed through 23,000 feet. The formation was still ahead, but within reach now. Kowalski pushed the throttles forward. The engines responded. Airspeed increased to 180 miles per hour. They were matching the formation's speed. The gap began to close. 1 mile, 3/4 of a mile, half a mile. The fire was still burning. Engine 3 was completely destroyed. The nacelle had melted. Internal components were exposed. Fuel was still leaking from somewhere, feeding the flames. But the fire had not reached the fuel tank. The wing structure was holding. Kowalski knew they had maybe 10 more minutes before structural failure. 10 minutes to reach the formation. 10 minutes to get back under the protective umbrella of coordinated defensive fire. 10 minutes before German fighters found them. At 11:25 a.m., 8 minutes after the fire started, Liberty's last rejoined the formation. Kowalski slid the bomber into position on the right wing of the lead aircraft. The other pilots saw the fire. They saw the destroyed engine. They saw the damage to the wing. But they held formation. No one broke away. No one abandoned Liberty's last. They were a unit. They would fly together or die together. The formation turned southwest toward the Adriatic Sea. Ploesti disappeared behind them. The flak stopped. The Romanian fighters did not pursue past the border. At 11:40 a.m., Liberty's last crossed the Yugoslav coast. Below was the blue water of the Adriatic. Ahead was Italy. Safety. Home. But the fire was still burning. Kowalski began descending. He needed to get below 10,000 feet, where the crew could breathe without oxygen masks. He needed to reduce airspeed to minimize the wind feeding the flames. He needed to reach an airfield before the wing failed. The formation descended together, 20,000 feet, 15,000 feet. At 12,000 feet, the crew removed their oxygen masks. They could breathe normally now. Bennett was unconscious. The morphine had taken full effect. Petrov stayed with him, monitoring his breathing. In the tail gun position, Staff Sergeant Michael Sullivan was watching the wing. He could see the fire clearly from his vantage point. The flames had diminished slightly. Less fuel was leaking now. Either the leak had sealed itself through heat expansion, or the fuel supply was nearly exhausted. Either way, the fire was smaller. Maybe they would make it. At 10,000 feet, Kowalski leveled off. Grotagli Army Airfield was 90 miles ahead, 25 minutes at current speed. The question was whether the wing would hold for 25 minutes. The aluminum structure was compromised. Stress cracks were spreading through the damaged sections. The wing could fail at any moment. If it failed, the aircraft would roll violently. Control would be impossible. Everyone would have seconds to bail out. Maybe not even that long. Marino was calculating fuel. They had been flying for nearly 2 hours. The 3 remaining engines were burning fuel at maximum rate. The fuel gauges showed 600 gallons remaining, enough for 45 minutes of flight. They had margin. Not much, but some. If they could keep flying for 25 more minutes, they would make it. If the wing held. If the fire did not spread. If nothing else went wrong. At 12:08 p.m., Liberty's last crossed the Italian coast. Below was Taranto. The harbor was full of Allied ships, American and British vessels that had supported the invasion of southern Italy. Kowalski could see the airfield ahead. Grotagli. The runway was visible, a long strip of concrete surrounded by olive groves and farmland. He began his approach. The formation broke up. Other bombers peeled off towards their assigned positions. Liberty's last was alone again, but this time over friendly territory. Kowalski lowered the landing gear. The hydraulic system responded. 3 green lights appeared on the panel. Wheels down and locked. He deployed the flaps. The bomber slowed to 140 miles per hour. He lined up on the runway, 1 mile out. The fire on engine 3 suddenly intensified. A new fuel leak had opened. Flames surged back along the wing. The wing root was burning again. Kowalski ignored it. He focused on the runway. Half a mile, quarter, mile. The wing was shaking. Metal was tearing. He could hear it over the engine noise. The bomber crossed the runway threshold at 120 miles per hour. Kowalski cut the throttles. Liberty's last dropped onto the concrete. The wheels hit hard. The landing gear absorbed the impact. The tail wheel touched down. Kowalski applied brakes. The bomber decelerated. 100 miles per hour. 80, 60. He steered toward the taxiway. Fire trucks were already racing toward them. Crew chiefs had seen the flames from the tower. Emergency vehicles surrounded Liberty's last before it stopped rolling. Firefighters hit the wing with foam and water. The fire died in seconds. Steam rose from the destroyed engine nacelle. Kowalski shut down the remaining engines. The propellers stopped spinning. Silence. After 3 hours of constant engine noise, the silence was overwhelming. Marino unbuckled his harness. His hands were shaking. Kowalski sat motionless, staring through the windscreen at the Italian countryside. They had made it. Somehow, they had made it. The crew evacuated through the waste gun door. Medics were waiting. They carried Bennett on a stretcher to an ambulance. His condition was critical. The burns covered 40% of his hands. Infection was the primary concern. Without antibiotics, he would likely lose both hands to gangrene. The medics transported him to the field hospital at Grottaglie. Army doctors examined him immediately. They debrided the burned tissue, removing dead skin and exposing healthy flesh beneath. They applied sulfa powder to prevent infection. They wrapped both hands in sterile bandages. They administered penicillin intravenously. Bennett remained unconscious for 18 hours. The rest of the crew was examined for injuries. O'Brien had strained muscles in both arms from holding Bennett's ankle. Petrov had bruised ribs from bracing against the fuselage. Everyone else was uninjured. They were debriefed by intelligence officers. They described the mission, the bombing run, the fire, Bennett's climb onto the wing, the manual feathering of the propeller. The intelligence officers took notes. They had never heard of anyone feathering a propeller by hand in flight. The procedure was theoretically possible, but practically insane. The fact that Bennett had succeeded seemed impossible. Liberty's last was declared a total loss. Ground crews examined the damage. Engine 3 was destroyed beyond repair. The wing structure had multiple fractures. 17 feet of wing skin had melted or burned through. The fuel tank had come within 18 inches of igniting. If the fire had burned 6 minutes longer, the wing would have exploded. The fact that the aircraft had flown 90 miles back to base with this damage was remarkable. The fact that it had landed successfully was miraculous. Bennett regained consciousness on August 10th. The pain was manageable with morphine. Doctors explained the extent of his injuries. Third-degree burns on both palms. Second-degree burns on his fingers. The healing process would take months. He would need multiple surgeries. Skin grafts would be required. He would likely lose some range of motion in his fingers, but he would keep his hands. The quick application of sulfa powder and penicillin had prevented infection. His hands would be scarred, but they would function. Kowalski visited Bennett in the hospital on August 11th. They did not speak about the mission. There was nothing to say. Bennett had done what needed to be done. Kowalski had gotten the crew home. The mission was complete. 2 men had died in other bombers during the Ploesti raid. Second Lieutenant Marcus Brennan, bombardier on a B-17 named Thunder Road, had been killed when flak penetrated the nose section. Staff Sergeant William Collar, tail gunner on Memphis Queen, had died when his position was hit by 20 mm cannon fire from a German fighter. Both men were 24 years old. Both men were buried in American military cemeteries in Italy. Bennett spent 6 weeks in the hospital. He underwent 3 surgeries. Doctors grafted skin from his thighs to replace the burned tissue on his palms. The grafts took successfully. By September, he could move his fingers. By October, he could grip objects. By November, he was released from medical care. The Army Air Forces declared him unfit for flight duty. His hands would never be strong enough to perform his duties as a flight engineer. He was reassigned to ground operations. He spent the remainder of the war training new flight engineers at bases in the United States. Kowalski completed 35 combat missions. He flew 16 more missions after Ploesti, including strikes on Vienna, Munich, and Berlin. He was promoted to captain in December 1944. His final mission was on April 15, 1945, 3 weeks before Germany surrendered. After the war, he returned to Buffalo, New York. He married his high school sweetheart, Elizabeth Nowak. They had 3 children. Kowalski worked for Curtiss-Wright Corporation, manufacturing aircraft engines. He rarely spoke about the war. When asked about the Ploesti mission, he would say only that Bennett had saved their lives, that without Bennett's actions, none of them would have returned. Marino returned to Boston after the war. He became a commercial pilot for Pan American World Airways. He flew DC-4s and later Boeing 707s across the Atlantic. He retired in 1975 after 30 years of civilian flying. He stayed in contact with Kowalski and Bennett through letters and occasional phone calls. They met at 449th Bombardment Group reunions every few years. O'Brien settled in Chicago. He worked for the Chicago Transit Authority as a bus mechanic. He married twice, had 5 children. He attended every reunion. He would tell anyone who listened about watching Bennett crawl across that wing, about holding his ankle while wind tried to tear them both off the aircraft, about the 4 minutes that felt like 4 hours. Petrov moved to Los Angeles. He became a radio technician for NBC. He worked on early television broadcasts. He never married. He died in 1983 from lung cancer, likely caused by exposure to asbestos insulation in B-17 fuselages. He was 62 years old. D'Angelo and Levine both returned to New York. D'Angelo operated a bakery in Brooklyn. Levine worked as an accountant in Manhattan. They saw each other occasionally. They remembered the mission, the fire, the fear, the impossible return to base. Sullivan stayed in the military. He made the Air Force a career, serving in Korea and Vietnam. He retired as a master sergeant in 1968. He settled in San Antonio, Texas, near Lackland Air Force Base. He died in 1994 at age 73. Keller left military service and attended college on the GI Bill. He earned a degree in engineering from MIT. He worked for Lockheed designing aircraft structures. He contributed to the development of the C-130 Hercules. He retired in 1980 and moved to San Diego. He died in 2001 at age 79. Pemberton became a teacher. He taught high school mathematics in Philadelphia for 35 years. He never flew again. The Ploesti mission had been enough. He died in 1997 at age 76. Zarnecki returned to Detroit and worked for General Motors. He assembled automobiles on production lines. He died in 1989 at age 68 from heart disease. Arthur Bennett lived in Cleveland after the war. His hands healed, but they were never the same. The scars were extensive. Range of motion was limited. He could not make a tight fist. Fine motor control was difficult, but he could work. He became a machinist for Thompson Products, later TRW Inc. He operated lathes and milling machines. The work was hard on his hands, but he managed. He married in 1948. He and his wife, Dorothy, had 2 children. Bennett rarely discussed the war. His children did not learn about the Plosti mission until they were adults. When they asked about his scarred hands, he would say only that he had been burned in an accident during the war. Bennett attended 449th Bombardment Group reunions when his health permitted. He and Kowalski remained close friends. They lived only 150 miles apart. They visited each other's families. They remembered the mission. They remembered the fire. They remembered the 4 minutes on the wing. Thomas Kowalski died in 2006 at age 87. He had lived a full life. He had seen his children grow. He had held his grandchildren. But the mission he remembered most clearly was August 9th, 1944. The fire on Engine 3. Bennett's climb onto the wing. The manual feathering of the propeller. The flight that should have ended in a fireball over Romania, but instead ended on a runway in Italy. Arthur Bennett died in 2011 at age 89. His funeral was attended by his children, grandchildren, and one fellow veteran. Raymond O'Brien, 91 years old, traveled from Chicago to Cleveland to honor the man whose ankle he had held for 4 minutes at 22,000 feet. O'Brien died 8 months later. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about flight engineers who climbed onto burning wings to save their crews. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Thomas Kowalski and the crew of Liberty's Last don't disappear into silence. Second Lieutenant Marcus Brennan died when flak hit his bomber over Plosti. Staff Sergeant William Kohler died beside his guns defending his crew. They were both 24 years old. They never came home. But the 10 men who flew Liberty's Last that day carried their memory forward for years in hospitals and factories, for decades afterward in Buffalo and Cleveland and Chicago, and across America. And now, through this story, their names live on. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.